Today's model kit is something that I kind of wanted from the moment I discovered that it existed. However, the last time it was seen as part of the Airfix range was back in 1996, which is just before I started modelling, so I'm not sure I probably would have seen it that often on the shelves when I was actually going into model shops. But after a bit of a gap, it has made its reappearance. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes. Join me on the workbench today as I build the Airfix Fairey Rotodyne in 1/72nd scale. This is an old kit which is going to put up a few challenges, but let's explore that together as we get it down onto the workbench. So this model kit was actually chosen for by you, the community, in a poll that I put up on my channel. To make sure that you can take part in polls and see them in your feeds, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that chance. But with this build, I don't think I'm going to go too crazy. I'm probably going to do it sort of out of the box to see what kind of result you can get with some simple techniques and products. But let's get into this one. So as usual, I'm going to put a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of what you might want to go and get if you fancy building this one for yourself. It is worth noting as well that I have already done a full unboxing video on this particular model, so if you'd like to take a deeper look inside the box at the sprues, the instructions and the decals, that would be the video to check out. In this one I'm going to be focusing on how it builds up and rounding it off with a review at the end. As usual, I'm going to start the build by cutting the parts that I need away from their plastic runners or small sprues using my side cutters. As this is a vintage tooling, we don't see the frames that we normally get in more modern releases. Everything just sort of comes on these little arms. And as it's an old tooling, there is some flash and excess plastic that needs to be cleaned up in various places. For the smaller bits of plastic, I'll use my sanding stick, but for other areas a sharp knife would be required to carefully shave it away. Here I'm using Humbrol liquid poly cement to glue together the internal cockpit parts. This requires joining the two chairs into their holes on the cockpit floor. There are two pilot figures included, and I have not glued them into place, just using them as a guide for where the control columns should actually go. There's no marks or locating points for these control columns, and if I put them in the wrong place, I won't be able to fit the pilots. Having done that, the control panel was then glued into its slot at the front of the cockpit, and then at the rear cockpit bulkhead, you can install the front landing gear leg. This is actually designed to be in a operational kind of condition. At the end of the build, you could technically raise and lower the landing gear, but the landing gear doors aren't openable or closable. They either have to be glued open or closed. So I'm actually just going to glue all of my landing gear in the lowered position and leave it at that. I get that this was sort of a design choice by the designers back at Airfix when this was created to have a bit of play value, but I'm not entirely sure that with the landing gear doors not being closable as well, it's particularly achievable. I would imagine that if you install it incorrectly, the landing gear will just collapse under the weight of the aircraft. So I'm just going to, as mentioned, glue everything solid. This rear cockpit bulkhead can then be glued onto the cockpit floor. And now it's time to prime. So the primer I'm using here is just the simple Humbrol No. 1 Primer Grey from the spray can, and this was sprayed onto these elements that I've already assembled, plus a few extra bits and pieces. There are some decals that go inside the cockpit, and I'm going to be using Microset and Microsol as my decal setting solutions throughout this build. So first up, the Microset was applied to the areas where these decals were going to go. Having identified the relevant decal, cut it from the decal sheet and then soaked it in warm water, it was then carefully slid into position. Some Microsol from the red bottle would be applied on top further to increase their adhesion to the plastic. For the crew figures, having already primed them as well, I painted their faces in Humbrol No. 61 Flesh. And then for their shirts, I painted that in 34 white. Their uniforms were painted in 25 matte blue. And their shoes were painted in 33 matte black. And with those figures dry, I glued them into their chairs in the cockpit. Now I'm going to use some Tamiya extra thin cement. And I used this to glue all of the clear windows inside the fuselage halves. Normally I use something like Airfix, but seeing as these windows are being glued in from the inside, and when I apply the masks later I don't want to push them out, I thought that an actual poly cement would be a better choice. I have used Tamiya extra thin before and it's worked relatively well, but I find if you get it in the wrong place it will leave some marks on the plastic, so I had to be super careful with my application of this cement to get the nice clean finish that I was looking for. The cockpit assembly was then glued into the front of one of the fuselage halves. And although you can display the crew door in an open position, I decided I would just glue mine in a closed position. At the front of the fuselage halves, I decided I'd make some little sort of baskets out of some sprue from the kit. I glued lengths of this plastic into place so that I could have somewhere I could glue in some liquid gravity. These small metallic balls will add extra weight at the front of the aircraft and help it stay standing on its landing gear instead of sitting on its tail. I used super glue to fix all these small metal beads down. The rotor head comes in two parts and this was glued together, but there was a bit of flash on this one that I had to clean off camera. There is also a small cap which goes at the top of the rotor head. The rotor head is designed to spin freely by installing this small backplate piece in here. At the end of the build though, I think I wasn't particularly careful with my glue and the main rotor doesn't rotate. Had I been more careful, it would have been something which would have been nice to have, but hey, sometimes these things happen. So I installed the rotor head and then carefully joined the fuselage halves together, running glue along the seams and applying pressure to help it glue together. I then carefully added the clear parts, and again some Tamiya extra thin was used to glue these in place, taking care to avoid getting it on the clear parts to minimise any unsightly marks. I then glued into place the open landing gear bay covers on the nose. The rear cargo bay doors do actually have the functionality to open and close, designed into the kit, but I'm not fussed about that, so I'm just going to glue mine in the closed position. Due to the age of this kit, it's understandable that there would be some gaps and poor fitting areas, so I identified them as best I could and filled them using some Humbrol model filler. I'm sure perfectionists out there could go and find all of the small errors that this kit has, but sometimes I feel like I just want to get it built and get it out of the stash and onto a shelf. So I'll do my best, I'll fill these little areas and sand them down to get a reasonable result, but I'm not really a perfectionist. Someone who is a perfectionist and who has also been working on this model kit is Nuno from Plastic Alchemist. And I asked him, what kind of problems have you had with this kit? Because, I mean, I've got these issues here, but I know that as a perfectionist, I think this one was driving him mad. So I'll quickly just hand over to him so we can explore some of the problems he's had with this kit.
Hello guys, Nuno here from Plastic Alchemist, and yes, indeed, I've been working on Rotodyne from Airfix. I thought it is a good idea, it will be a quick build, you know, give me more views on YouTube, but little do I know. It's not a kit for the faint at heart, that's for sure, and there's a lot of work to be done if you want to achieve a proper result. So let's have a look of what I've been doing and what I still have to do. One of the things that I didn't like was the open door, the open cargo door on the back. Closing it has proved a task and a half. We had to fill it up with styrene plastic on here, fill styrene plastic on there, and then smooth up the edges. What happened is that on the process all the rivets are gone. So now we are on the process, like you see here, we are on the process of re-engraving all of them, as you can see here. So we've done these ones, but we still have all these to do. When I bought this when it came out, and I thought this is gonna be it, I'm gonna get it out, do a video, do it quickly, but no, prove it to be wrong. So yeah guys, if you wanna see more of this, I'll be launching the video once I finish, so you guys can see everything that I've done, all the things that I've went through. I hope the final result pays off all the trouble that we are having. Thank you so much for your attention, guys.
Well, thanks Plastic Alchemist for sharing your insights there, and it'll be really interesting to see what yours looks like when you've finished it. No doubt it will look considerably better than mine, seeing as you're fixing all the problems the kit has, whereas I'm kind of not. I think I'm probably just doing enough for my own sanity, otherwise you could spend the rest of your life working on one model kit. But yeah, make sure you check out Plastic Alchemist's channel to see how it compares to my build when it is finished. But moving on, having filled and sanded my themes that I've identified needed a little bit of extra work, it's now time to move on to masking the clear parts. And I've been very fortunate to receive a free review sample of the CT Scale Model mask set for this particular kit. Thanks to CT Scale Models for sending this one out, but opinions do remain my own, as this video is not sponsored. I find the CT Scale Model mask sets to be very high quality, and the instructions tell you where everything needs to go. The masks are all appropriately sized, simply peeling them from the backing paper and sticking them into the relevant location. This is a product which I find speeds up the build of the kit so quickly without compromising on the finished results. On this particular kit, for the large window at the front, the masks frame the edges of it, however you do need to use a little liquid mask as well. For this I used some Vallejo liquid mask to fill in the centre area. With that done, I moved on to glue the wings together. They come in two parts, and this is a simple step to join them. I just had to make sure everything was aligned correctly though. I then turn my attention to the tail surfaces, and again this comes in a number of parts. Some of them are in two halves, but it's relatively straightforward to join them all together. It is worth noting that again a little extra play value is included in the kit, in the sense that the rear elevator has been designed to be freely movable, but again I don't really care about that, and I'm just going to glue mine solid. Having glued together the various elements of the tail surfaces, the final part is this small support strut, which can be a little fiddly, especially when you come to join it onto the model, just trying to make sure it goes in the right place. Now I need to build the engine nacelles. I've already done one off camera, so I'll just show you the process I used. First up, I opened up the hole for the propeller, as it was a little bit flash filled and I found that the prop wouldn't go through it properly. So a small drill bit was used to do this. Then I inserted the retaining pin from the back and glued the prop on the front. Again, we have a little bit of play value that these should freely rotate if you do this correctly. Sadly, as discussed in my unboxing video, one of the prop blades had come unattached in my kit. Fortunately, it was a simple matter to glue it back on. But it is a little disappointing to have broken parts inside of your kit when you buy it brand new from the manufacturer. Inside of the engine nacelle, I glued into place the landing gear legs. Again, as mentioned, this is designed to be able to be raised and lowered, but I'm not fussed about that, so I glued it in the lowered position. I then joined the other half of the engine nacelle onto the top as well. The landing gear covers were then glued into place in the lowered position, and then this engine exhaust part was glued into its place on the side of the nacelle. There's one on both sides, so this was replicated there as well. The propeller assembly could then be glued into place at the front of the engine nacelle, and this other part of the air intake was glued into place. There aren't really any locating marks for this, so it's sort of just best guess. This assembly is then glued into the relevant position on the wing. The main rotors have these little parts for the tip jets, and these are simply glued into place at the end of the rotor. And now with that done, it's time to prime again. So I'm using Tamiya Fine White Primer on the main body of the aircraft. The point of this is because whilst it will also act as a key for the next layers of paint to stick to, I actually just want to leave the top part of the aircraft white, as that is the colour it's supposed to be as indicated by the painting instructions. After a number of thin coats of this paint, at which point I've built up a good opacity of the colour, I masked up the top of the aircraft so that it would remain white, and I've bought specifically for this project a new paint. This is a Vallejo Model Air French Blue. Part of the reason why I can afford to buy new paints and products to complete my builds is thanks to the generous support of my Model Club members. A massive thanks to these guys on screen for the extra support they give the channel. If you'd like to find out more about what becoming a Model Club member means, check out the links in the description. But anyways, back to the build. This French blue colour was added into my airbrush and then sprayed on the nose of the aircraft. I'm following the painting instructions here for the areas that should be this colour, but I don't need to worry about painting the side panels blue because there are decals for that. Having done that, I'm going to put it to one side to let it dry and move on to the rest of the aircraft. I haven't bothered priming this because I think that this Humbrol number 11 silver spray paint should stick to the plastic really well and not actually need one. So this was sprayed over everything else that should be a silver colour, including the rotors, the engine assemblies and the tail surfaces. Not forgetting, of course, the areas on the main fuselage, now that that blue paint has dried and been masked off as well. And when that was dry, I carefully removed the masking tape and it seems to have done a pretty good job. CT scale models have also included masks for the landing gear. So having sprayed these silver, I then added these masks to protect the hubs. These were then spray painted with Hobbycraft Matte Black. And when that was dry, I carefully removed the masking tape to reveal a nice neat edge. And now we can move on to the decals. There is a moderately large sheet of decals included in this kit, and they feature the side panels for the aircraft. These are printed by Cartograph and are to their normal high standard. I cut the sheet into more manageable sections and then soaked them into warm water to allow them to release from the backing paper. Again, I'm using microscale set and sol in the same manner that I did for the cockpit transfers. I brushed on the micro set, added the transfers in the relevant position, and then further layers of micro sol would be used to soften them down into the surface details. As this is an old kit and it features lots of raised details, I just wanted to make sure that it would all conform to the surface nicely. The decals that go on the side of the fuselage were a little bit of a faff. I found that they were printed to a nice quality, but they weren't quite sized correctly. So the distances between the windows don't seem to be particularly uniform. And in some places I had to cut the transfers to get them to remain in the relevant places, because otherwise they would become out of sync with the windows. So this was the best way that I could think of to fix that problem. This was a little bit fiddly and a little bit annoying, but I think by the end I kind of managed to get where I needed to go with this. In the final build, you can notice in a few places that the decals don't quite line up. They're lined up perfectly with like the first 2 or 3 windows, and then after that they get ever so slightly out of sync with it. But I found cutting the transfers and shortening those gaps was the only real solution to that problem. But it's still not perfect, and I'm sure a perfectionist would go and fix that. Some of these decals are quite large as well, so you do have to be careful when you apply them to make sure you don't rip them inadvertently or have them looking a bit sort of wonky. So I'm going to leave those decals to cure, and whilst they're curing, I hand painted on some more of that French blue Vallejo paint onto the spinners of the propellers. A few thin coats of this would be needed to build up the opacity. Having done that, I picked out the tips of the blades in 24 trainer yellow. This should just point out where the dangerous spinny bits are on the propellers. And then I did some of the panels on the props in 33 matte black. I did this freehand, and in hindsight my hands were a little bit shaky, so actually masking this may have been a better choice, but I think it will do. It's not massively noticeable in the final build, but if you go looking for it, you will spot it. Those engine exhausts on the engine nacelles were given a coat of Vallejo gunmetal. And with that done, it was time to start gluing all of these sub-assemblies onto the aircraft. Part of the reason why I've done it in this way is to maintain those nice solid colours as required by the paint scheme. The wings of the aircraft were glued into their relevant slots on the side of the fuselage. This was then followed by the tail surfaces, taking care to get that lower support strut into the relevant hole on the bottom, and making sure that everything is square and level. Having done that, to give the entire aircraft a uniform finish and seal in and protect those transfers, I used this Army Painter satin varnish. A few thin coats of this was applied over the entire model. I then glued the wheels onto their landing gear axles and carefully removed the sponge which was masking the lower cockpit part. I added this much earlier to prevent any spray paint from going inside the cockpit and making a bit of a mess. I then glued on the main rotors, having actually opened up their mounting points ever so slightly to make sure they fit correctly. In hindsight, I wish I'd left these sort of as push fit. I think some people have even experimented with putting magnets in there so you can actually take them out, because in the finished build they're quite big and they take up a lot of space. So if you're storing this or moving it around, having those removable would actually be a good idea. For me though, they're stuck and it takes a lot of space up on my shelf up there. With those rotor blades now in position, I carefully peeled off all of those CT scale model masks, and they've done a fantastic job of keeping those clear parts clear whilst ensuring that we have nice solid lines on the frames. And that's it. That's as far as I went with my build of the Airfix Fairey Rotodyne in 1/72 scale, and I'm going to call it complete. So there we have it, the finished Fairey Rotodyne, a kit that I wanted as a child, and well, now finally I've had the chance to do it. I'm just going to show you, this is how big it is once you've finished it, which actually makes it kind of one of the biggest kits I've built this year so far, which is a bit of a shame because I would like to build more bigger kits, but they just take a bit of time, don't they? This one, time-wise, we'll have a look in the book where I keep all of my notes. This one took me 3 days, but that would have been 3 days like devoting time to actually doing this one, and I have built it pretty much in an out of the box kind of style. Bit disappointed that the main rotor head is glued solid. That's not going to rotate. I have been a bit uncareful with my gluing, but the main engines on the wings, they work perfectly fine, so there's not a problem there. Landing gear did have the design that you could raise and lower it, had some play value, but mine are glued solid. However, I did add that nose weight, and that helps it stay nice and level when it's on its wheels, which is really good. I did worry that it would probably tip if I didn't. I don't know that it won't if you don't. I just thought I'd play on the side of caution there. The rear doors can open and close if you install the parts correctly for that, but I glued mine shut. But eagle-eyed viewers, as you look through the clips, may be able to notice gaps that I haven't addressed, and there's even still some seams here which could be tidied up more. I didn't go excessively on tidying up the seams because this features a lot of raised rivets and I didn't want to sand all of them off, which is something that Plastic Alchemist suffered with his build and has had to address all those problems. So to keep this as a 3-day build, I decided to not focus on lots of different areas. I didn't address all of the seams, I didn't address all the ejector pin marks. There's some on the sides here which, you know, are visible, they could have been cleaned up. The lower side as well, the seam down the bottom isn't particularly neat, but again, you're not probably going to see that one. I think this is just straight up, almost out of the box, to see what it would look like when it's finished. I think had I had this as a kid and tried to build it up with all of the functional elements, it would have been great fun. However, part of the reason I decided to glue the main doors closed and the crew door closed was there's an absolute lack of any interior detail. I know that this is technically the prototype and there were parts of it which didn't actually have much of an interior as a prototype, but for in use they were looking at potentially flat flooring it for other cargo loads or having chairs for passengers. So some sort of interior would have been nice to have seen. Naturally, you could go all out on this one, you could address every issue that I had here, and you could even motorize it, add lights and so on, if you fancied doing so. I think the good parts of this kit were that the decals are printed to a lovely quality. However, I did find them to be out of sync with those window locations, and I had to kind of fix that by cutting them and then overlapping them to make the distance shorter, just so that those windows and the gaps in the decals would remain aligned. The build of the model is generally fairly simple and straightforward, but naturally given the age of the tooling, and it's a 1959 tooling, so one of the oldest kits that Airfix have in their repertoire, it does suffer from those massively overscale raised rivets, panel lines, mould seams, excess flash and ejector pin marks. Not to mention, of course, that mine came to me with a broken propeller, which, although it was a small job to just glue it back together, is a bit disappointing when you're buying something directly from the manufacturer. I think this was actually a pre-order and it came straight after they got the stock in. How much would you be looking at paying for this one? Well, at the time that I built it, it was £20 and 49 pence RRP on the Airfix website. Bearing in mind you are getting cartographed decals which are very high quality, but in this case I did find they weren't quite designed to be the right size. On the box it states you're getting 115 parts, although on the website it says it's 112, so actually I'd have to go through and count to make sure which one is correct. But I'd probably go with the one on the box. And given that you've got quite a large aircraft model at the end of it, I think that £20.49 is maybe about right, but I would always be looking at getting this one cheaper, especially given the amount of work that may be required to get it to a more presentable condition than I've done so in this build. I think though, it's probably time to wrap this one up. This was a model that isn't massively overly complicated to do, having only used hand painting and rattle cans to complete it to an out-of-the-box kind of condition. Yes, I have not addressed a lot of the problems with the kit, but that helped to keep this into a relatively quick project. It's a bit disappointing that this only comes with one paint scheme for the Rotodyne Prototype, as I know that there were some other ideas for an in-service RAF version or for use with commercial airlines, which would have been interesting to see as an alternative. On the whole, I'm pretty happy with my final results, having finally had the chance to build this kit that I always wanted. Now that I've had that experience though, and with the issues that this kit presents, I'm not entirely sure I could be tempted to get a second example. I think one was probably enough. And with that, it's time to end the video. Once again, thanks to everyone who voted to see this one on the channel, and to my Model Club members for their extra support. If you'd like to support the channel in other ways, there are of course ways to do so, and full information is available under the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Thanks to CT Scale Models for that free review sample of their mask sheets, and also to Plastic Alchemist for taking part in this video. Don't forget to go check out his channel so you can see how his build compares with mine when his Rotodyne is completed as well. Finally though, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. Fairey Rotodyne, build and review, sync. I think I fixed it this time though, so hopefully maybe a little tweak to the synchronize there, but hopefully it should be okay. Part 2. There is a moderately large sheet of decals I'll do that again. Part 3, sync.